As the war in Ukraine continues to be a priority for Russia, it comes with a steep social cost. Defense spending far exceeds funding for critical social sectors like healthcare or education. Today, we take a look at the state of these public services, access to medicine and doctors, the rise of infectious diseases, and indoctrination in schools, how the war is affecting the lives of ordinary Russians, and how the Kremlin has dealt with these long-term crises. Russia's 2024 budget is a war budget, and as much as 25% of it is hidden. This means that part of the defense costs are accounted for under other budget items. Let's see what it looked like in previous years. In 2021, Russia allocated as much as 4.5% of its GDP, which is 6 trillion rubles or $90 billion, to defense and internal security. In 2023, this amount increased by 70%, which is 6% of Russia's GDP, or 10 trillion rubles and around $120 billion. During that same period, spending on healthcare and education increased by only 20%. Officially, over the next few years, war spending will amount to about $540 billion, while the sum earmarked for healthcare and education is around $490 billion. The Kremlin decided to counteract the underfunding of the public sector by instating the so-called May decrees signed by Putin, which included increasing public sector salaries.
W maju bieżącego roku, po
In May this year, following the inauguration of his illegal presidency, Vladimir Putin signed another of the so-called May decrees, or documents containing development plans, this time until 2036. Similar documents had already been issued in 2008, 2012 and 2018. Among other things, they provided for an increase in the number of employees paid from the state budget, including teachers, doctors and others. Only 11 Russian regions, including the illegally annexed Crimea and Sevastopol, managed to fully implement the recommendations to increase salaries for budget workers. However, we must remember that the Russian authorities cheated. First, the average, not the regional salary, was set as a benchmark. The methodology of its calculation was also changed. What's more, the authorities at lower levels engaged in technical manipulations, such as shifting employees to nominally different positions or reducing the number of posts. As a result, even among regions that theoretically fully complied with the recommendations to increase salaries, the rates for budget employees for doctors and teachers generally do not exceed the average in Russia. What's more, salaries also vary within a region, depending on whether you work for a federal, regional, or municipality institution.
One of the biggest problems in healthcare is with staffing, and specifically with low salaries. Nearly 60% of doctors say their wages are not enough to meet basic needs. The average salary of a doctor in Russia is about 100,000 rubles, or about $1,000. Staff shortages are most acute in the periphery and small towns, and programs have been launched in 2012 and 2015 offering a one-time payment of nearly $23,000 to take up jobs in small towns and villages.
W efekcie mamy do czynienia z brakami
We are facing a staff shortage which is estimated at around 30,000 doctors and 60,000 so-called mid-level practitioners, i.e. nurses, paramedics, midwives. This means both an excess of work for Russian healthcare and limited access to healthcare for the population. Russia's uneven socio-economic development means that both access to medical services and their quality vary greatly between regions. Large agglomerations such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, but also regions with resources, offer markedly higher rates for both doctors and medical personnel, and thus draw them from all over Russia at the expense of other, poorer regions. Moscow alone spends more on healthcare than the next 9 highest spending regions combined. The worst situation with staffing is in the smaller towns and outlying regions. The authorities are trying to counter this, for example through programs that offer high one-time payments to doctors or nurses and paramedics in exchange for taking a job in a village or smaller city, but these are insufficient.
Russia is also struggling with an increase in infectious diseases. Incidences of measles relative to the previous year have increased by over 128%. In addition, there has been a 17-fold increase in whooping cough cases and a 3-fold increase in influenza cases. This is due to a shortage of vaccines, and in March, this shortage was in 16 regions.
Zmniejszona liczba szczepień ma dwojakie podłoże.
There are two reasons for the reduced number of vaccinations. On the one hand, there are temporary shortages of vaccines in the regions. On the other hand, there is strong public distrust of vaccinations. Support for compulsory vaccination in Russia is among the lowest in the world due to, among other things, a grassroots Russian distrust of the authorities. The pharmaceutical market in Russia has not been affected by international sanctions, but the war has increased the costs of doing business for Western companies. As a result, Western pharmaceutical producers have cut back on drug sales to the Russian market and additionally stopped releasing new products to the market, which has contributed to a reduced range of drugs in Russian pharmacies. Western drugs are being replaced by drugs from India, for example, but also by Russian generics, which are often of lower quality than the drugs they are supposed to replace. Similar situations exist with medical equipment, of which about 70% is imported. Medical equipment has also not been covered by international sanctions, but problems related to transportation, to payments, and with restrictions imposed on so-called dual-use goods make it increasingly difficult to import them from Japan, the United States, or Europe. As a result, Russia in the coming years will be forced to shift to medical equipment of Asian production, primarily from China.
Many Russian regions, including large cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, experienced a shortage of insulin, 75% of which is imported.
Dotyczy to m.in. insuliny Aspart o krótkim czasie działania, której...
This includes the rapid-acting insulin Aspart. Government purchases fell so much in the first quarter of this year that it became nearly impossible or very difficult to get hold of it in many pharmacies across Russia. Last year, Russian pharmacies sold the lowest amount of insulin in 5 years. Since the beginning of the invasion, there were also problems with accessibility to blood glucose monitoring devices. What's more, in many regions there have also been problems with access to treatment for HIV patients, of whom there are officially about 1.2 million in Russia.
The war is also placing a direct burden on Russia's health services. During the 2 years of hostilities, at least 2,500 doctors from 50 regions were deployed to the occupied Ukrainian territories.
Co więcej, wśród 300 000 zmobilizowanych we wrześniu 2020
Moreover, among the 300,000 reservists mobilized in September 2022, it's thought that 1% were doctors and medical personnel. This year, the Kremlin is expected to allocate nearly 9 billion rubles to healthcare in the newly annexed Ukrainian territories. War and losses at the front are associated with increased demand for medical services. This is shown, for example, by a record increase in the number of Russians requiring rehabilitation equipment, wheelchairs, prosthetic limbs. Moreover, instances of mental disorders among Russians have reached the highest level in 10 years, and sales of antidepressants have reached the highest level in 5 years, which may be indirectly related to the war and social costs.
Russia also has a shortfall of teachers. In recent years, the number of teachers leaving the profession increased by 1/3. While in 2017, 140,000 teachers quit their jobs, in 2023, that number rose to 190,000. Another issue concerns salaries. Teachers' salaries in Russia are among the lowest in the group of paid specialists in Russia. The average pay is $630, but in the majority of regions, the starting salary does not exceed the minimum wage, which is little over $200. Yet another issue is the terrible state of schools themselves. When Russia invaded Ukraine, 1 in 10 school buildings in the countryside did not have central heating. 12% did not have access to water or plumbing. And overall, 6,000 schools in Russia don't have access to both sanitation and water.
Tak jak w przypadku służby zdrowia, największym problemem
As with healthcare, the biggest problem in the education sector is inadequate funding, which translates into both low salaries for teachers, which is prompting increasing numbers of them to resign, and the generally poor technical condition of Russian schools, although here the situation varies region by region. The invasion of Ukraine has greatly accelerated the militarization and ideologization of Russian schools. Examples include activities such as propaganda indoctrination, conversations about what is important, and the restored preliminary military preparation that was obligatory in Soviet schools. Lectures are also given to students by veterans of the invasion of Ukraine, who often turned out to be criminals with long criminal records. Since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, nearly 100 schools across Russia have been renamed after heroes of the so-called special military operation.
Почта России.
There are also problems in Russia's post office. In 2023, 27,000 branches were located in villages and distant towns. Most of them were unprofitable and in poor technical condition. Due to financial problems and staff departures, more and more provincial post offices are closing permanently or working only on a limited basis.
Poczta Rosji, oprócz tego, że jest drugim największym pracodawcą w kraju, jest
In addition to being the country's second largest employer, Russia's post office is also one of the few Russia-wide institutions that bind the countries together by operating even in its most inaccessible and remote areas. For millions of Russians living in hard-to-reach areas, the post office is often the main, if not the only, service provider. Therefore, the closing of post offices would primarily mean the progressive social, economic, cultural and communication exclusion of rural and small-town populations. First of all, those who receive social benefits through the post office, for example. Contrary to the optimistic tone of the propaganda, the Kremlin is aware of the poor state of Russia's public services, and especially of the potential political, economic, and social consequences of this. The authorities are trying to counteract the crisis with ad hoc measures, but also with long-term programs. However, all of these measures are ultimately reactive in nature and, as such, are unable to stop the degeneration of Russian public services, only being able to slow it down. Admittedly, these measures are keeping Russian public services such as education and healthcare at a certain level, but it is still low.
Уважаемый Владимир Владимирович, к вам обращаются сотрудники Сибирского федерального научно-клинического центра.
Można odnieść wrażenie, że Rosjanie poniekąd przyzwyczaili się do tego.
You could get the impression that Russians have somewhat got used to the fact that public services do not work well and that there are constant difficulties in accessing them. As for dissatisfaction, it is primarily expressed by the employees of these public services, as reflected, for example, in the growing numbers of teachers resigning, or in the appeals made independently to Putin by employees of dozens of ambulance departments throughout Russia. In these appeals, they demand increased salaries. Although social frustration over the poor level of public services in Russia may be growing, we should not expect a widespread protest movement to develop against this backdrop, which could politically threaten the Kremlin, and for a variety of reasons, including poorly formed horizontal ties in Russian society due to the fact that Russian civil society has virtually ceased to exist, but also for the trivial reason of Russia's geographic vastness. If anything, we should expect first and foremost more and more resignations among the employees of Russian public services such as education, healthcare and the postal service, but also single speeches or protests by employees who demand better employment conditions.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, take a look at our other coverage of Russia on screen now.